Okay, good evening, everyone. So, just with this Zoom webinar platform, it usually takes a couple of minutes for all of the participants to arrive in the webinar room. So, just to give a little bit of background about the public square and what we're doing here before we start properly. The public square is an institution, a fairly informal institution from Perth in Australia. It used to happen on a weekly basis throughout semesters at a pub in Fremantle, but we haven't been able to do that this year, of course, with the pandemic. So we've decided to restart it as a series of webinars in running once a month through the pandemic. So my name is Dr. Alexander Davis. I'm a lecturer in international relations at the University of Western Australia. Tonight I'm representing the Public Square, but also the Australian Himalaya Research Network, which is a network of scholars interested in the Himalaya, which was started last year. And we haven't been able to do very much, obviously, with all the cancelling of conferences and things, but this is one of our first events. So it's very exciting to have you all here tonight. So I'll be moderating this discussion, but also you can't see her, but my UWA colleague Mona Chetri was instrumental in putting this together. So thanks to Mona as well. So in June of this year, border tensions saw the worst violence in India between India and China for decades, with clashes in the Galwan Valley and Ladakh particularly gaining the world's attention. International political analysts have tended to see India-China tensions through a sort of conflict or cooperation lens, primarily focusing on the foreign policy elites and the militaries involved. The Himalaya then is seen as this site where two enormous states meet with one another, fight, and eventually, hopefully, compromise and back down. But this is only one of the region's many problems. The Himalayas ice deposits feed most of Asia's large rivers and moderate the global climate, helping to produce the yearly monsoon, which provides water to most of South, Southeast and East Asia. Climate change could have catastrophic impacts on the region, and some have argued that this is actually being accelerated by the presence of the Indian and Chinese and Pakistani militaries in the region. The Himalayas' diverse terrain has also helped to maintain a rich diversity of languages and cultures, which are not easily fitted into the territorial box of the nation state. The Himalayas' precarious geopolitics are contributing to the political, cultural, and linguistic transformation of the region and an environmental transformation as well. So, what is happening on the ground now in India, between India and China? Should we be worried about it? And what is the relationship between the conflict, the people who live near it, and the fragile environment in which it takes place? We have two exceptional speakers to talk about this tonight. Our first speaker will be Jaban Jacob. Jaban is an Associate Professor of International Relations at Shiv Nada University in Delhi, India. His research focuses on China-India relations. He's most recently co-editor of a book called China's Search for National Rejuvenation, Domestic and Foreign Politics under Xi Jinping. Jaban, welcome. And Dr. Ruth Gamble is a lecturer in history at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She's an environmental and cultural historian of the Himalaya. She's particularly interested in changing environments and this environment's relationships with the people who live on them. She's currently writing a book on the Yalam Tsampo Brahmaputra River, and she is also a close friend and regular collaborator of mine. Welcome, Ruth. Thank you both for being here. So we're using Zoom's webinar format tonight. There is an ask a question button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Those questions will come through to me, and I will put them to our speakers once our speakers are done. So please do send your questions as you think of them. And don't wait till the end of the talks, because then they'll all come through in a rush and it'll be harder for me to put your question to the speakers. So each speaker will speak for 15 minutes and discuss these issues, and we'll have roughly half the session left over for discussion. Thank you, Jaban. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the Public Square for organizing this, for inviting me. Let me also thank Mona for sort of liaising, putting this together. It's also good to meet Ruth virtually. We met several years ago in Japan, And, COVID is a strange sort of situation where we end up meeting people who we, normally wouldn't expect to meet except in person. But this is a great way also, if one is minded to look at things positively, a great way to actually touch base, meet up, and discuss. And I suppose in that spirit, I also have to say this is actually my first sort of presentation in Australia, even if virtually. So it'll be interesting to hear your questions, even if the audience is, I think, from around the world. Let me quickly sort of address the geopolitical context to this conflict, and maybe sort of lay the ground a bit for what I think is also the primary focus, which is the environmental and the cultural aspects to this conflict that Ruth will also be discussing. Now, India-China relations, I think, is a subject of great interest increasingly, but the one aspect that people constantly keep forgetting is that bilateral relations are seldom smooth, but they have also never been quite so bad, except of course the 1962 conflict and until now. That both countries have somehow found value in trying to keep the relationship on some sort of even keel. So therefore, the default position of the leadership on both sides has been to sort of portray the relationship as being normal and in reasonable fettle. Now, I would argue that this sort of default position has actually cost India much more than it has cost China for a variety of reasons, political, in terms of reputation, in terms of principles that India holds dear and the Chinese don't. In terms of economics as well, the trade relationship between the two sides has been extremely lopsided. But let me quickly, from the point of view of the Himalayan region, quickly give you a couple of examples as to why I say that this relationship is uneven or has cost India. Now, from the political point of view, you should remember that the two countries actually hold something called the hand-in-hand anti-terror exercises. Now, the problem is that the two countries do not agree on the definition of terrorism. And, from the Himalayan perspective or from the perspective of border regions or mountain regions, India has a number of insurgencies, conflicts in the hills that would all, by the Chinese definition, be called terrorism, instead of the political problems of communication, of the relationship between the center and the provinces that they are. From the economic point of view, most of the Indian border regions are actually flooded with Chinese goods. This has, of course, we can't really blame the Chinese for it, in the sense that China is actually filling a gap where the Indian economy has not been able to. For example, you might find flasks and blankets produced in Shanghai, in the region of Ladakh, which is 4,000 kilometers away. Whereas, regions just a few hundred kilometers away from Ladakh also produce blankets, but these blankets somehow never reach Ladakh because of the infrastructure problems, logistical issues, and so on. So that's, to give you a sense of what is happening on the border regions. Now, we had another issue that involved the Himalayas, which is the standoff in Doklam in Bhutan in mid-2017 between the Indian and the Chinese armies. In this particular case, it was the Indians that went into Bhutanese territory to push the Chinese back, who had intruded and started building infrastructure on disputed territory, I must add, territory disputed between the Bhutanese and the Chinese. Why did the Indians do it? Because the Bhutanese had asked them to, and we have a sort of a special relationship between the Bhutanese and the Indians, in which the two sides are supposed to come to each other's aid in case of problems, military problems. But following Doklam in 2017, the two sides, again, India and China, engaged in what we call the informal summits between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi on the two sides, as a way of putting the relationship back on the rails. They sort of made it look like the informal summits were some sort of a diplomatic breakthrough, that some progress was being achieved in the relationship. except that the problems have cropped up so often and so regularly that it fools no one. And therefore, we have in 2020 the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations, the establishment of diplomatic relations between India and China, problems on their disputed boundary along the line of actual control. Now, these facts are undisputed that the Chinese transgressed into territory that is held in Indian hands as of now, and that the Chinese did violate multiple agreements in so doing, that they continue to stay in location across even their perception of the line of actual control, that is in territory that the Indians have controlled since 1962. It is also extremely unlikely that the status quo ante, that is the status of the LAC, along the LAC before April, the end of April this year, when the Chinese started intruding, is unlikely to be restored. On the Indian side, our response has sort of fallen between two stools in the public domain, as it were. The Prime Minister made a statement that was neither here nor there, trying to say that things were under control, that the Chinese had not intruded, and yet the facts sort of fly in the face of this assertion. Now, in terms of Indian response, let me just step back a bit and talk about the first, in general, a response to the rise of China. Now, India has responded to the rise of China in a number of ways. And I think there's a certain tendency towards self-flagellation in India, saying that we have not responded to China adequately, as well as doubts externally among partners and friends, saying that India hasn't quite done all that it could do with respect to China. The fact of the matter is that nobody has a disputed boundary with China like we do. And therefore, nobody has a sort of a power differential with China that we do. And therefore, our responses need to be tailored, keeping this in mind. Having said that, India has responded in a number of ways. It has partnered very closely with the United States over the last couple of decades, with Japan, and now also in the second iteration of what we call the Quadrilateral Alliance, that also includes Australia. We are, of course, we've been miffed with the Aussies for quite some time, given how the first iteration fell apart because the Aussies couldn't, well, as we put it in India, couldn't stand up to Chinese pressure and walked away from the Quad. So in the second iteration, the Quad has come through, but we are still holding off on letting the Aussies into the Malabar naval exercises, which is likely to happen anyway pretty soon. Now, in the present instance, it isn't the case that India can't respond militarily on the boundary, on the LAC, but it's a question of the consequences and whether India can sustain that response. Also, the larger question that we need to ask is, what has China actually gained from this activity, this violation of all agreements on the LAC, in the casualties? I mean, this is the first time since 1975 that there have been casualties on the line of actual control between India and China. And this has not gone down well in amongst the Indian public. And therefore, we have a situation in which public attention in India, elite attention in India, is pretty much turned almost completely away from Pakistan and towards China. And I think as somebody who studies China in India, I think that's a good thing. Because we've always been crying for greater attention to what China is doing, Chinese politics, Chinese economy, and we've got it, in a manner of speaking. Now, in terms of what the two armies are doing militarily on the boundary, this is something that Alex referred to at the beginning. All of the activity that the two armies engage in at the boundary or at the border have consequences. They have environmental consequences, they have social consequences, they have political consequences. Now, last decade and more, India has raised two mountain divisions. India has raised a strike corps that is aimed specifically against China. India has opened up several advanced landing grounds right along the LAC for its heavy aircraft to land. 72 different roads for the border areas from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh have been commissioned since 2004. About 60 odd of them have been completed or are nearing completion. Now, Siachen, I think, has been referred to tangentially. Siachen, the highest battleground in the world between India and Pakistan, certainly has seen some environmental consequences. But also all these road building in the boundary areas, especially in Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh, I think have had consequences. And I think one of my collaborators, Mirza Zulfiqur Rahman, is probably also on this in this as a participant, as an observer in this video. And he and I have actually traveled quite a bit in Arunachal, and we've seen these roads being built, and they're basically being built through virgin forests with massive environmental consequences, obviously, as a result. In Ladakh, which is a cold desert, off-track driving, for example, disturbs a very thin topsoil in these areas with effects down the down the chain. And of course, the Chinese have been engaged in dam building along on the Brahmaputra, and I'm sure Ruth will talk about this. In India, there are multiple fears, sometimes unfounded, about the consequences of this dam building for Indian ecology further downstream. And one way India has sort of tried to respond to is by building dams of its own. In fact, hundreds of dams are in the pipeline, large and small, in Arunachal, without quite taking into account public input or public sentiment on these matters. Now, in terms of economic consequences, naturally, conflict will have economic fallout. But even without conflict, I think the border is an economy that is predicated in many ways on military presence. Certainly in India, tourism to a large extent depends in many areas because of infrastructure that the army has built up. But tourism and population pressure then puts pressure on water resources. There are other political consequences, of course, like the tussle between Ladakh and J&K, and which people in Ladakh thought was resolved by the dilution of Article 370 in India and the conversion of J&K into one union territory and Ladakh into another. But expectations don't seem to have been met yet. And then within Ladakh, there is some sort of relatively minor tensions between the Buddhist majority and the Shia, the Buddhist population of Leh and the Shia Muslim population in the Kargil area. So there are also societal consequences. There's a problem in Arunachal, especially, that Mirza and I, on a field trip, we discovered that there is sometimes a intergenerational conflict. There are people who say, look, it's enough of living in the Stone Age. We need development. We need roads. But there are also people who say, but we need to preserve our environmental heritage, our cultural heritage, which is tied in with environmental, with the mountains, with the hills, and so on. So, I think in terms of a conclusion, I'll come back to the boundary dispute and the geopolitical impact, which is that despite about 22, in fact, meetings of special representatives that have been ongoing between the two sides since 2003 and multiple rounds of negotiations before that since 1980, the boundary dispute remains unresolved. I think at core, the Chinese concern is about Tibet, and that's a whole different set of issues that we can talk about. But at the heart of it, essentially, the two sides will need to agree that the map of India, the map of China will need to change as a result of any boundary settlement. And unfortunately, one would think that strong leaders in the two countries would have the capacity to persuade their populations to achieve this, to do this, to accept this change of maps. But in effect, what's happening is because these leaders rely so heavily on nationalism, they are unable to get off this tiger and unable, therefore, to resolve. I think in the foreseeable future, they're going to be unable to resolve the boundary dispute. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks to the audience, we've got several questions coming in already. So do keep sending those through, and I'll start putting them to our panelists after we've heard from Ruth Gamble.
Yes, I wanted to start by saying that I'm at the moment sitting in lockdown in Melbourne, and I'm on the unceded lands of the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nation, and otherwise known as Victoria, which is yeah, like I said, in lockdown. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is not just to pay my respects to this alternative vision of what Australia is or what this land is, but also to show you that there's multiple ways that we can look at how these boundaries and how these states are constructed. And I think this is something that's really important when we look at this issue of the border regions between China and Tibet. It's also important for Australians to acknowledge that, but it's something that I think is a key element to looking at this, because basically what you're dealing with is two incompatible stories, incompatible understandings of what two nations, two states are, or two nations are, that I can't see how they can be resolved without a thoroughgoing look at the region's history and an acknowledgement of the complexities in that history. And I can't see two strong leaders, in inverted commas. I have to put that in there because, yeah, I would say that strong leaders show compassion and diplomacy. But anyway, two strong leaders, in inverted commas, can't back down from that because, as Jabin said, they are so invested in nationalism, right? So I can't see how we get out of this. I honestly don't see how you would have to have a way for them both to save face and come up with a new lie. It's the only way that I can see that this could be resolved without that idea of looking back at history. And I think that looking back at the history of the region is important, not just from a political perspective to try and resolve the situation at the moment, but in order to understand the complex social, environmental, and cultural and linguistic problems that are playing out in the region, right? So the first thing I think that needs to be understood in terms of looking at the history is that neither India or China are natural laws like gravity. So the way that people often keep presenting this, the tensions between China and India is like, there is China, there is India, they exist, and this is their border, right? But they're both constructed ideas. They both came about through historical processes and developing ideas of what China is and what India is. And this is what, if they were a natural phenomenon, there wouldn't be an issue here, right? But because they're both constructed, because they're both relying on different versions of history, then this is where we have the tension. And then you have these two different stories. On the Indian side, you have a story about the liberation from colonialism, the colonialism of the British, and we all know the horrible stories of partition, but there was this idea that India inherited British borders a lot of the time. And from the Chinese side, there's a kind of a different story, which I found it fascinating in Xi Jinping's response to this latest border war. He said we have to fight for the lands that our ancestors gave blood for. So it's very much like a blood and soil version of the history. And I was like, I don't mean to be disrespectful, President Xi, Dada Xi, your ancestors were in Ladakh when? Yeah, there's definitely very much a construction of history in his telling of that story. But I think the way that he understands it and the way that it's presented in the Chinese or in the Chinese population, or in the what passes for a public sphere in that country at the moment, is this idea that anywhere that was Tibet was necessarily China, right? And so this is one of the stories of erasure that we see happening on both sides of the border, that has come to this incompatible stories about all of these border regions, right? First of all is that Tibet as an independent or as a different nation didn't exist. That's the first one. That's kind of wiped from the map. But then also within, on the Indian side, you have all of these amazingly complex groups of different linguistic and cultural and ecological groups with complex relationships with each other and cross-border trade. And so when Javan was talking about the blankets crossing the border, I'm so not surprised, because there was back in the day before the Indian and Chinese states developed, there was trade coming through there that would go all the way to Central Asia, to Shanghai and on to Britain. It's always been a place where there's been so much trade across those Himalayan passageways. So these histories haven't been, in order to erase them in the way that it sometimes seems like these two mega states are trying to do it, it takes an enormous upheaval of people, of cultures, of environments, and an enormous transformation. I'm not saying that it's not possible, because I have to, acknowledge, as an Australian, we tended to wipe out all different groups and then create a new sense of space for identity for a nation as well. But I do think that this is the kind of transformation that you're looking at here. Yeah, and you couldn't say that that was a balanced version of transformation, because clearly the Indian state infrastructure it enables a lot more flexibility. Enables a lot more pushback. It's a democracy. You can, like the Ladakh, the different hill stations in the Ladakh area show that there is space for people to create their own local governments and their own autonomous areas. And I think that's a big part of the reason that the people of the Himalayas, often the different groups, often side with India as opposed to China, because that nation state allows, or that state structure, and that enables them a certain amount of liberty and independence or autonomy that the Chinese state would not. So you get those tensions there. But the fact that all of this story is being told through these two massive nation states and these two different visions of that place that are often a projection of an idea of what a state can be based on lowland areas. I think that that's part of a big issue that would need to be resolved before you can see any kind of sensible engagement with this complicated cultural and ecological space. Right. So I kept thinking about it in terms of the way in pre-India-China nation-state time, when you had border treaties between the Tibetans and the Ladakhis, or the Tibetans and the Dogra, and the Merpas were doing trade with or I should say the Tawangpas were doing trade with the people in Lhasa. There was multiple relationships, there were multiple trade routes, and if they did decide on borders, they were always based on passes as opposed to mountaintops. Right, so what you've had happen in a kind of geographical way from the time when India and China started claiming these areas is a transformation where, from a way of engaging in cross-border trade and cross-border exchange through mountain passes in summer. And this is one of the things that I think is key to this area that people don't talk about enough, is the difference between winter in these regions and summer in these regions, right? It's a completely different world. So you had trade across mountain passes in summer, and a much more loose area or boundary regions in the mountains between the mountain passes. Right? But since they've come in, there's been this kind of enclosure, or an attempted enclosure, of the spaces between the mountain passes. So you've had them trying to move up into glaciers, like in Siachen, but I mean, Siachen's not the only glacier that you have troops moving into. You have them moving up and down valleys like Galwan, where which was never occupied, or through lakes like Pangonso, which was again never occupied. So it's an enclosure on these environmental spaces that were never there. And the idea that more and more people are coming into these spaces is putting an enormous amount of pressure on those places environmentally, hydrologically, and it's also, the thing that really strikes me is how many of the soldiers actually get harmed by being in those spaces as well, right? So I guess that was going back to try and explain the current context, but it strikes me that when you're looking at it at the moment as well, what you're seeing is a shift in the way that they're approaching the border, in that beforehand there did seem to be some kind of agreements between the two different sides about where they were in winter and where they were in summer. And in the same way that you had a change in that on the Pakistan and India side, with when they both decided to occupy Siachen all the year round, that you're getting the similar sort of thing happening with China pushing into this area through its buildup of infrastructure on the Tibetan side of the border. So there's that change, and then you also have the pressure that coming from China as it's developing its nationalism, maybe sometime in response to the COVID outbreak and trying to push a different narrative. And that was the other thing, the other major thing that I wanted to talk about in the terms of the relationship between China and India. And I think Yabin was absolutely correct when he said that this tends to be a more India looking at China issue than China looking at India. As an experiment this afternoon, I typed into Weibo, India is, and one of the first questions that came up is where? Into the Chinese search engine. So there was very much a sense that although China is very much taking up the public oxygen and it's a major topic of discussion in India, India doesn't seem to necessarily be a major topic of conversation in China. In China, the major conversation is America. Right, and the trade wars and the tensions over Trump and Hong Kong and those type of engagement. So I think that there's kind of imbalances that need to be taken into account. There's environmental issues that will continue to unfold unless there is a reckoning with history, and given the fact that these nationalist tensions are rising, not just in China and India, but all around the world, and underpinning a realignment of international geopolitics, I can't see that changing anytime soon. And that was really depressing, but I've been in lockdown for 4 weeks now, so I don't know if I can muster much positivity at the moment, I'm sorry. So that was, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much to both our speakers for their very depressing talks about the state of the Himalayan region. So we do have a large number of questions to get through. So I'm going to try to synthesize some of them so that we can get through as many as possible. But our mutual friend Mirza Rahman asked something that I was tempted to ask myself as well, or that draws on a similar theme. So Mirza asked that in the Galwan incident, there were reports of the river being blocked by Chinese soldiers temporarily and then using the force of the water later to take Indian soldiers by surprise, which eventually killed many of them. And this demonstrates the connection between the conflict and the use of the environment by the state, between the conflict and between the geopolitics and the environment, I suppose. So I was wondering if both our speakers could just quickly cover how closely tied together is the environmental tension and the environmental issues linked to the conflict. Do you see them as particularly interrelated?
Sure. All right, since Ruth. Okay, so Ruth, I'll go first. So I think, yes, I think Mirza raises an important point, but I do not think that the countries are necessarily cognizant of environmental issues when they decide to do whatever they want to do on the border. They are cognizant of environmental factors sort of standing in the way. But, the Chinese state has historically been a state that has survived on large engineering projects, right? And these engineering projects have always been about damming rivers. And if you look at China right now, I mean, they're going through one of the worst floods in living memory. And where are the PLA troops? The PLA troops are actually being engaged in, rescue efforts, rehabilitation efforts, and so on. So this is something that the two armies certainly know and understand and do very well, that they deal with these environmental issues, catastrophes everywhere. But, and I think, given the nature of the Indian and the Chinese armies and, well, yes, Pakistani armies as well, they don't really care too much for the life of the soldier. I mean, more soldiers are killed in Siachen owing to the cold than because of enemy fire or shelling or whatever. So, I mean, this particular instance that Mirza mentions, 2 Indian soldiers were washed away or drowned because of the hurry in which they were trying to get the bridge built. And so, yes, and I've already mentioned the case of the Arunachal dams and so on, which have their own consequences, and sometimes not immediately, but later.
Thank you very much, Devin. Ruth, would you like to have a go at this question?
Yeah, first of all, I would be hesitant to say that we don't know all the details about what happened with that river as well. So I'm hesitant to make an assumption that exactly what happened, because another thing that happens with these rivers a lot is that they change. I mean, goodness, I'm looking back at texts from 600, 800, and they're talking about people getting washed away by rivers changing all the time. So how much of it was engineered by the Chinese troops and how much of it was just what happens at this time of year in this region, I don't know. And this is part of what I meant by this idea of the particularities of this environment and how people engage with it, and the idea that you can just operate in that sphere like you would with an army somewhere else is, I don't think, very feasible. The other thing is that there is actually a really long history of, having prefaced it by saying I don't know this is what they're doing, right? There is a long history in Chinese army traditions of using water as a weapon of war. And particularly the biggest use of environmental weaponization of the environment occurred during World War II with the Yellow River, where Chiang Kai-shek's they bombed a dam or got rid of a dam, and it flooded a whole region to push back Japanese troops and killed millions of people. So you get, there's kind of an idea of weaponizing the environment in those traditions, but I don't know what happened there. But I think that there's something that happens at a much slower pace. You don't have to have 2 armies fighting each other and manipulating water to smash each other up in order to be damaging the environment. I think in one thing that I actually wrote with Alex and a couple other people, we used this idea of slow violence, talking about the transformation of the environment in these spaces. If you continually have development that isn't focused on the particular environmental needs of that region, and it's focused on the development of the state, then it ecks away at the health and well-being of the ecosystems and the people in it slowly over time. And you see that with the dams coming in, the roads coming in, the airports, and all of the build-up of infrastructure on both sides of this very fragile, of this border, which is in a very fragile environment.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions also on public opinion, and mostly focused on Indian public opinion as well, but it might be worth commenting on Chinese public opinion as well. Andrew Chubb and Ted from Kyushu have both asked about the role of Indian public opinion. So do the Chinese care about Indian public opinion? How closely do you think they monitor it? That one was and then the other question is, how quickly, if at all, would the Indian public forgive China or begin to see it as a more potentially friendly state to work with? Might be more question for Jabin.
Jabin, yeah.
I want to take off from where Ruth said, about her search on Weibo and what the results turned up. So the first thing is, look, India is very, very low a priority for the Chinese at any given point of time. Now, having said that, it's somewhat interesting that this particular incident has had an effect, I would say, on both publics. See, where the Chinese are focused on the Americans and the Indians are focused on the Pakistanis, what these casualties on June 15th and it's not casualties only on the Indian side, though we have numbers only for the Indian side, but there is for sure casualties also on the Chinese side. So, I mean, when you ask a man on the street or a woman on the street who says, listen, hey, how is it that we have suddenly got casualties on this boundary that none of our political leaders ever talked about? I mean, that's a question that perhaps maybe in China they can sort of cover it up, but in India that's not so easily covered up. So you have to actually deal with the question. In fact, one of the side effects, I would say, of Prime Minister Modi's extreme focus on Pakistan and to say all these, cross-border surgical strikes, cross-border airstrikes, is that this tendency to believe that, well, we've taken care of the Pakistan problem. What do we do about the China problem? So in a way, it sort of comes back and bites you. And this sort of a situation, at least from the Indian point of view, increases attention on China. And I think it's sustainable to a certain extent. In the case of the Chinese, I don't see that this particularly changes things. Though I would say perhaps that the weight of India scholars or India specialists in the Chinese think tank sphere probably has gone up a bit, because even they are ranked very low in the food chain as far as intellectuals are concerned in China. But one thing I would sort of add here is that in the case of India, I mean, you say how sustained the interest will be or how quickly China will be forgiven. Look, we are a democracy. I think for the Indian people in general, even China is not a big priority. I think Indian politicians have to worry about forgiveness every 5 years at election time. I mean, we are not so concerned about China when elections come around. Foreign policy is very, very low, very low priority as far as Indians are concerned.
I would also say that minorities that live in the Himalaya and the different groups are also way low priority when it comes to Indian elections as well. And I think that this is part of the reason that you end up with those, even though India is a democracy, a lot of these issues, environmental and social and cultural issues get disappeared as well, is because there is such a large group of people that it's very hard to get voices heard from these marginal areas.
Thank you very much. So we have, just following on from that, we have a question from Mona Chetri, which I think ties quite well with that discussion and what you were just saying, Ruth. So a lot of these regions, at least on the Indian side, have special constitutional protections. Thinking of Sikkim, and some of these have been changed recently in Ladakh and in Kashmir, obviously, and in Ladakh there's currently movements asking for greater constitutional protections and recognition. How does this conflict play? How does this change the domestic Indian politics of the Himalayan regions that we're talking about?
In India?
In India, yes.
Yeah,
well,
I was going to say
worth talking about
technically
as well. Yeah.
Technically, Tibet has special status in the Chinese constitution too. But
Javan, do you want to have interest?
I thought Ruth was going to handle that. Look, I'm no expert on the legislative sort of exceptions that the Indian state makes for border areas, except that, as Ruth just mentioned, sometimes these are observed more in the breach, and that in practice on the ground, the Indian tendency has been, as in the case of civil-military relations, is that, well, to sort of look at everything as a sort of a standalone box where the two sides don't seem to interact with each other. So, well, you've got your special status, just do your thing. But this is what as a rentier central government, this is what we sort of demand from you, and this is what you will give. And therefore, we have a case in which political elites in these border areas are also divided along national lines. Often they do not represent local interests as much as they sort of become part of the larger national narrative. And that also happens if you look at it inside the TAR, inside Tibet, where the Tibetan membership of the Communist Party of China is much larger than the overall exiled population of Tibetans outside Tibet. So it's not as if we can sort of discount that, and that's also a factor that we need to take into account. And really, despite the fact that it's not so much the fact that India is a democracy that is at issue here, but the fact that India is a federal state, and we are in no manner really a truly federal state. We are actually pretty unitary in character and in practice than we are a federal state. And that's the problem.
I agree, and also would listen to Javan on this. There's a couple of other things, though. I think that there has been a move from the BJP government to try and cultivate relationships with Buddhist communities, particularly along in these border areas. And you see like a lot of internal Buddhist diplomacy, from what I can tell, and this can imbalance power, local power balances, and I think that that's happening a little bit in Ladakh, and you get the appropriation of Buddhist culture in the pursuit of in the cause of the Indian state. And then I would say that you can kind of understand from the local position that they're trying to find a way to get power in a very massive sphere when you're a small group. So I can understand these relationships that the local people make, or the local groups make with the larger powerful entities. And I definitely know that that's the case with those in the Tibetan minority who join the Communist Party. I mean, if you're a Tibetan in the PRC and you're not in the Communist Party, it is really hard to get any advancement, or you're already at a disadvantage by being Tibetan. If you choose not to be in the Communist Party, you're constantly watched even more. So I can, I totally understand. I'm not sure that it's all about a commitment to the ideas of Mao and Marx that people are joining those parties, and I see it as like a survival strategy in a very difficult political environment.
We're getting a lot of questions about how the conflict can be resolved. I might just leave those towards the end. I think we have an interesting point here from Samina, who asks, to what extent is it actually possible and realistic to look at this as a bilateral issue? We haven't talked about Pakistan yet. So how would you think through the India-Pakistan tensions in this sort of political, geopolitical, ecological context? Does that have similar resonance to the India-China issues? Ruth?
So I actually think Javan knows a lot more about this than me, but there's one thing I actually wanted to say in my talk, which I didn't say, which is related to this. And I would say I wouldn't be underplaying the role of the Belt and Road Project and the development of the West, and the idea of making a corridor through Pakistan and through the Gilgit region in the flare-ups of these tensions. You've seen a constant kind of infrastructure push west within the PRC. Every time you go there, there's another train line going a little bit further west, and there's more, I don't know, weird suburb-looking things in the middle of the desert in Western Tibet. So there's like this kind of push west, and it's kind of almost getting to the stage where it's up against the Indian border. And in order for China to develop its Belt and Road Project through Central Asia, it really needs to have really good control over the Pakistan corridor. So I think that development project is playing into these tensions, but I couldn't tell you exactly how.
So if I might just add to that, I think what's happening is clearly environmental issues do not respect boundaries, fixed boundaries, political boundaries. They have an impact across the board. And as Ruth just mentioned, some of this is slow impact. It takes years to manifest itself, water issues and so on, or the melting of the glaciers. But on top of this, and we have something like the Belt and Road Initiative, or even India's own North-South Transport Corridor, actually large infrastructure projects that cross geographies, that cross climate zones. And again, we come back to the question of engineering. Engineers seem to think that they can build and modify without consequences to the environment or to local populations. I think that needs to be kept in mind. But it's also, as 21st century, everybody's aware of climate change, and if for nothing else but to score brownie points, these projects, these governments will actually sort of doff their hat to environmental issues. So therefore, we have something called the Green Silk Road under the Belt and Road Initiative, as if there is some acknowledgement of environmental issues. But in practice, something else altogether different happens. In Arunachal Pradesh, for example, all these dam building, the Indian government has a whole series of environmental laws, environmental impact assessments, public hearings, and so on. But again, as I said, some of these are observed more in the breach, or some of these are just sort of tamashas, as we say in India, shows put on to make sure that, okay, these things are carried out on paper, but in effect, very, very little consultation has taken place. And I think, and this is not going to be limited only to India, China, or even India, Pakistan. I think there's a question before about Nepal. I mean, Nepal is sort of in between this entire project, Nepal and Bhutan, in fact. In Nepal, the Nepalese are getting a lot of these hydroelectric projects built by the Chinese, or which the Chinese wish to build. And these are going to have downstream effects, certainly in India. Even Bhutanese projects. I mean, we saw a recent case in which the Bhutanese were accused of blocking a river or something, and therefore leading to flash floods downstream in India. I mean, this was a false news, but it's had its impact, and you don't know. It's not just the environmental impact, but also the information warfare, propaganda, and all sorts of interethnic tensions. All of this sort of can blow up at any point of time for any number of reasons. And we have to actually address the question of border populations a bit more closely, because I think there's a question again about how Ladakhis are prevented by the Indian Army from accessing their traditional grazing grounds. Again, this is an entirely military initiative, because it was done entirely for military reasons. But as a consequence, as Ruth mentioned, there's an erasure of history. People tend to forget local practices. People tend to forget local histories. And, and there's a colleague of mine, Bhim Subba, who's done some work in Sikkim. Also Uttam Lal, again from Sikkim University, who've done work on yak migration across the border in Sikkim and Tibet. And actually this has been stopped because of the fact that the armies are there. So all of these consequences are happening in real time with impact on local societies, local economies, local populations, local histories. So all of this will actually spread across borders.
I was going to say, and that stopping of yak migration may have led to a large amount of yak deaths in the region as well. A couple of years ago, yeah, it's quite dramatic.
Moving on to some of the ways that this can be solved, I want to ask you the really big picture question to wrap up. But first, before that, there's a question here from Yu Tao. And he asks if there can be a role played by other players, so international, regional organisations, other great powers. Some people have suggested taking ideas from something like the Arctic Council or the Antarctic Governance System. Do you see any role for other external international actors in dealing with these issues?
Sorry, I just laughed, but didn't Trump offer to fix it? Yeah, you guys don't have to worry.
Yeah, I don't think that went very well.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I feel like this idea, there's a lot of models that you could use, and it would be so fantastic. It would be really great if there could be a space for those models to be implemented. The Arctic Council, because this is the thing. This is not a normal border. This is, I know I've said that a few times. It's not like, I mean, are there normal borders? I don't know. It's not a space that's easily managed, right? As a border, it's a very fragile, very particular, very important environmental space. So I think using something like the Arctic Council, or thinking about the ideas of creating ecological spaces for ecological protection in this region could be a really important way forward. But in some ways, you have to get China and India to get over their history in order to do that. And in some ways, I kind of understand where they're coming from, because if you are a kind of post-colonial country, if you're finally getting your way back into the world stage after hundreds of years of humiliation and white people being idiots, then you really don't want to listen to them. I wouldn't be wanting to listen to them if I was in that situation. So I can understand why there would be a resistance to letting someone else come in and negotiate.
Yeah, I want to add by also answering a question that Ted Boyle asks about the constitutional provisions and the Chinese reading of these constitutional provisions. I think we saw a few years ago that when the Nepalese were trying to settle their own constitutional provisions, the Chinese were extremely concerned about the nature of federalism that the Nepalese would get into, whether it would be ethnicity-based federalism or whether it would be federalism based on geographic division. And for the Chinese, this is extremely important. And they are concerned also about what happens on the Indian side, because it's a matter of how their own relationship with their minorities is going to be taken into account. I mean, we know stories often of the Indian side where Indians in Arunachal or in Ladakh or, or in Kargil will point across to the border on the Tibetan side, or even on the in Xinjiang or in Gilgit-Baltistan on the Pakistani side, and say they have electricity, we don't have development. But there is also a political way in which minorities on the other side are looking into the Indian side and say, hey, they have democracy and we don't. So the Chinese are extremely concerned about this. And when the two states are actually dealing with these very local concerns among their own people, I don't think they have the bandwidth to actually acknowledge or have any patience for external mediation in these matters. As Ruth put it quite eloquently, we've had quite a lot of, we're still paying for the consequences of colonialism in this part of the world. So I think we haven't yet finished trying all that we think we can do, even if they are not looking good right now. And therefore, I don't see the Indians and the Chinese, two very proud civilizations, two very proud people, stupid on occasion, but the governments will never acknowledge on either side that they are being stupid or that they could use help from outside. So I don't see that, these sort of issues will be necessarily resolved by outside intervention. Whether a bilateral mechanism on these things can be built up, that's another possibility. But what little examples that we've seen through, say, the BCIM, the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Regional Forum, that there has been some talk of environmental coming together of environmental organizations and so on, or some studies. Now that has actually taken off. So at this point in time, especially where sensitive border areas, where both countries are still struggling to find political legitimacy in their own ways, I don't think anybody from the outside is going to be allowed in.
I just have one more comment to that. From traveling around in the TAR and in the in the PRC, when people are talking about across in India, the thing I've heard most is actually they've got religion. They're allowed to practice religion and we're not. And there's this, and I think that idea of the role that Buddhism plays in those, particularly on the border, I know it changes as soon as you go down the hill and you have a complex of different religions, but it's it's playing a very important role across the borders in those regions.
So I'm going to ask you, and this is quite mean of me because we really only have 3 minutes left. We've got a lot of questions on what's going to happen, and I'm going to take two of those from the most extreme possible angles. So Nicholas Bentage asks, given limited resources and growing populations, is it not inevitable that there will be ongoing and escalating conflict in the Himalaya? And then Nikon asks, how can we imagine the Himalaya as a region and not as a contested area between nation states? So I think those are excellent provocations to give you each a minute and a half to sum up your thoughts on what's going to happen in the region. Javan, would you like to start?
Okay, to this, I might also add the question that Mona asked a little before about why war hasn't broken out yet. And I think to that, the answer is, well, both countries don't want to lose their war. I mean, there's nuclear weapons, they don't want to lose face, they don't want to lose, and they'd be held to pay among their own, own domestic populations if something of that sort happened. But, the fact that we can't imagine the Himalayas as a region, that we continue to look at them as sovereign, as a space divided among sovereign states, is really to do with the history of the region. The fact that colonialism had such a long-standing impact is the issue. I mean, the EU today talks about a Schengen area where borders are sort of irrelevant, well, until COVID at least. But, the people in this area, once we get onto an idea, we sort of accept an idea, we sort of let go of it very, very slowly. And the idea that we sort of caught onto a sovereignty and sharp borders between nations and control from a majoritarian center, where border regions, border populations are peripheral, both literally and figuratively, to the entire issue. And therefore, I think the Himalayas, in a sense, essentially become an area for conflict, escalating or steady state, but conflict nevertheless.
I agree. I don't think that they're going to get into an all-out war because it's mutually assured destruction. So I think we're dealing with a slow standoff that it causes destruction. At some point, I think they will run out of other options and have to do the right thing. Because ecologically there are limits on the way that you can behave in this region, and at some point it's going to be in their interest to cooperate to maintain an ecological stability there, because the consequences of not having water for billions of people are too big.
Okay, well, we're out of time, so I'd just like to close by thanking both of our speakers for their fascinating responses to this extremely difficult topic. The Himalaya is not always talked about in this kind of ecological, cultural context. And so hopefully we've done something to redress that tonight. So thank you both very much. And thank you very much to our audience as well. I realize there's a lot of webinar fatigue out there. It's a very competitive marketplace at the moment, the online webinars. So thank you very much for spending this evening with us. And I hope everyone is able to stay safe and well and indoors if you're currently locked down as well. Thank you very much, and we'll have another session in roughly a month's time, so keep an eye out for that as well. Thanks.